Uh, all right. Uh, how's everybody doing? Very good.
Good.
Can't complain.
All right. Fantastic. Um, I heard that there was a tornado going through Clemson yesterday, and I
That
wasn't
was
sure.
fun.
Yeah, I bet it was. My neighbor had a 60-foot oak tree going through his house, so
Uh,
not great. Um,
Ouch.
thank God, like our house like was no damage, so we're in the clear. So we came right back to Georgia. Uh, so anyway, so for the guys who didn't attend to this meeting before, we are essentially meeting every week to talk about our research in layman's terms. We're trying to like get used to the idea of like talking about what's important on our research without having to go into science easy too much. And this week we have really good uh, a really good guest, Mr. Melvin, who is going to talk to us about how it is to talk to a reporter. He's a director of communications in the science College of Science. So he's done really good work, and we're welcome you, Jim, to the conversation. Thanks for
thank
coming.
you. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a longtime journalist with the St. Pete Times and Greenville News, Charlotte Observer, a couple other newspapers. And journalists are trained to be journalists in the sense that we're trained to be able to take information that we don't have a clue about and very quickly become sort of like temporary experts, write an understandable and accurate story and hopefully entertaining story, and then put it out to the public quickly. At the St. Pete Times, when I would write stories, there would be more than 1 million people who might read it. So accuracy is important, being entertaining is important, and understanding subjects that you know nothing about is important. So that kind of skill was drilled into me, just like your education as a scientist is being drilled into you. I think there is a parallel there, and it's just another skill. It's something where you learn a lot about. And so it translated very well when I came to Clemson and eventually came to the College of Science to be able to talk to scientists they can't speak in a word that's less than about 25 letters and has a bunch of, symbols all over it and things that, I don't even have a clue about. I mean, some of the papers you guys write that are published, when someone like me first looks at it, it's like you're reading in a different language or something, like I'm reading it in Chinese or whatever. So it's an important skill to be able to start there and eventually turn it into a story that someone like me would find entertaining and provocative and accurate. And there's processes to do that. Part of the process is being educated in it, and that's where that will be the hardest part for you, because you haven't been educated in it like I have, just like I haven't been educated in your expertise. But it doesn't mean that it's impossible, and there are a lot of different different ways to approach it. One thing that you probably don't want to hear, but it truly is accurate, is, at least from your perspective, is you really have to dumb it down. I mean, you almost have to dumb it down to what you would think would be like a 3rd or 5th grade level. And what you would think is a 3rd or 5th grade level will be very like what my level is. It's analogous to, I don't know if any of you played golf, but if you ever played golf and gone to a golf instructor to improve your swing, the first thing he'll tell you is, I want you to swing at like 20% of the speed that you normally swing. And you'll do that swing and you'll hit the ball and it'll go flying off perfect. And the instructor will say, great. And you'll go, yeah, wow, that's slow swing. I can't believe it. And the instructor will say, that wasn't a slow swing. That's the swing you should use. And so when you guys are when trying to communicate with the public or with the media, I think you need to dumb it down. The easiest way is to slow way down and sort of communicate in a way that to you feels almost sophomoric and just ridiculously easy, but to the reader will be, and the media and stuff will sound perfectly normal and be the perfect swing. Now, I don't know if that makes sense, but it's a good start. Um, there are aspects to every story. One is being understandable. Another is being accurate. So you can't make a story understandable and remove the accuracy. You can't, increase, exaggerate, or you can't unexaggerate. And then you need to make it entertaining and even provocative, because even if people can understand a story, if it's just completely boring to them, they're not going to want to read it. And one of the ways to being entertaining and provocative is the title you use. We call it headlines in journalism, or titles. And then the second way to be provocative is to have a hook. And a hook is something like, this research I'm working on could eventually one day lead to a cure for all cancer. Well, of course, that's exaggerated, but the research has to have some kind of a hook, some kind of timeliness to it, some kind of reason why it's important. And I know that's difficult sometimes with basic research, because basic research is often foundational, and it doesn't eventually lead to a tangible, immediately tangible result. But you have to at least give examples of what those tangible results eventually could be, and what role your research might play in that. I'm going to share the screen now and show you an example of a story that I wrote that I think you'll probably all recognize. Find it here. That's not it.
All right.
Did I lose you?
No, you got it. We can see you.
Okay, I'm trying to get to it. Here we go. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
This story here?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. So this story you'll probably recognize was Marco's research on starlight. This, in terms of, other than coordinating the eclipse, this was the biggest story I've probably been involved in. It had more than 200 pickups around the world, including New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, just about anything you could name, the story got picked up in. And the number one reason, of course, that they got picked up that way is because they measured all the starlight ever produced by the observable universe, which is pretty incredible. But what is really incredible about it, to me, and I would think to you, is that, as you know, we're just this tiny little speck in the middle of nowhere in this, incomprehensibly vast universe. How are people on this tiny little rock able to measure all the starlight ever produced in the universe? So that was the first thing I did. And if you were to actually write a story, the first thing, of course, is what we call the lead. And you see the lead here. If you read that, from the laboratories on a rocky planet dwarfed by the vastness of space, Clemson University scientists have managed to measure all the starlight ever produced throughout the history of the observable universe. Well, I don't care who you are. If you read that, you're going to keep going, right?
Hey, Jim, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean by your hook?
That is also the hook. In this case, that is the hook. The hook can sometimes come further down in a story, like in the second or third paragraph. In this case, the hook came in the first paragraph. Although this story had two major hooks. One was that, and the other was that Marco was the lead author in science, which is very unusual for our university to be. We have a lot of stories in science, but very few were the lead author. So all stories start out with this lead, and you're keeping the hook in mind. Even, the hook is even in that title. It's a very provocative title. You could have gone with a much more general title that wouldn't have, interested people nearly as much. Then you normally go into a transitional period that follows the lead. Leads can be very, basic and newsy, or they can be kind of featurey and kind of fun. But you eventually have to get into the nuts and bolts, like the newspaper, we call it the nut graph. Where it talks, and these next two paragraphs talk about what the research was about, and the paper and links and things like that. And so now, if all you do is read these first three paragraphs or the story, whether you're in the media or you're just in the general public. You 90% of what you need to know about this research. And I'm going to go back to something in a little while, but one of the things that you notice in here is there's a lot of interesting words, interesting verbs like dwarf and vastness, tour de force, 2 trillion galaxies and trillion stars. All of these are very active, interesting phrases and words, but accurate. So once you've gotten past this first part, the lead, whether it's a feature lead or a news lead, and then you've gotten past your nut graph part, the part that people really need to know. Like if you, it's sometimes good to make a list of like 10 things that you want to say in your story and put them in order of importance, and then write it that way. I mean, that's a form of an outline. Usually then it's followed by a quote, and usually your best quote, the sort of summary quote that wraps things up mostly. And then you go from there. Then you can use other techniques. Like, for instance, I asked Marco, well, put this into some tangible form of what this actually means. And he came up with a number of photons as the number 4 followed by 84 zeros. This got picked up all over the place. Newspapers had it across the top of their front page, on websites and everything. This number became a very popular hook to the story. From there, if you're using your 1 through 10 kind of thing, then you hit probably like number 3, and you go from there, and a couple of more transitional paragraphs followed by another quote, followed by paragraphs until you finally come to an ending. Endings in media releases and newsy type things usually end up being like a quote or something. In a more narrative piece, if you're writing a magazine article, then you want to write the ending that sort of gives you that weird feeling in the pit of your stomach, that kind of, ending that just jars you. Media releases, you'll use less of that, but it's an interesting technique if you ever write for a magazine. In terms of identifying, of course, there's a bunch of different things you could say about Marco and the other people in the story. So you usually don't want to say it all at once. Like in the first quote here, I'll identify him as lead author of the paper. But then when I go to the second quote, assistant professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy. Third quote, I don't know if I say anything more about him. But you can see when you identify people, if they have several different things about them that you want to use, don't throw it out all at once or put it in one paragraph. That's usually not the right way to do it. Now, unless you were saying something like, Joe's accomplishments included being president of and then you could do it that way. But that is the basic structure of how most stories are written, and certainly most media releases are written, with a lead, transitional graphs, quotes, more transitional graphs, quotes, and then an ending. And then you want to use, interesting words. Again, dwarfed. Somewhere in here I use the word circumvent, star-making tour de force. Sentences that are really active and have active verbs, managed to measure all the starlight ever produced throughout the history of the universe, very active. Alliteration, and then you can take it even further with using things like alliteration, like managed to measure. That's done on purpose, not by accident. And analogies are another very important thing for scientists to use, because analogies you're able to take something very complicated and make it analogous to something that's not complicated. Like, the definition of analogy is a thing that is comparable to something else. So, you could say, the blah, blah, blah resembled a crashing wave on the ocean or something, or, those analogies are just a really important thing. I probably could find more examples of that if I called up some of my other stories.
And that's, Jim.
Yeah.
Just that last week, for those of you who weren't here, everybody spent about 5 minutes just answering those 3 basic questions that we talked about, their research, what do you do, how do you do it, and why is it important? And as the moderator, and Raphael asked me to be the moderator just because I don't know anything about science. And that was what I told the group last week. That was one of the most helpful things that all of them used in their talks were analogies. So taking something that's incomprehensible to me and relating it to something that I can grasp made it much more comprehensible.
Right. And one thing about writing, it's just like anything. The more you write, the better you get. And the more you read, the better a writer you'll be. So reading is very important. I've read probably several thousand books in my lifetime. And when you read books, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, or you read magazine articles, or you read even media releases, every time you read something, you pick up one little thing that sort of becomes part of your voice. And it becomes this like soup almost in your brain that comes out as your own voice. When people talk about having their own voice, my voice, I think, would be described again as using very active sentences. Passive voice, I don't know if you want to learn much about active versus passive voice, but like for instance, a active sentence would be, let's see, I can't think of an example. I'll have to think of some examples, but an active sentence usually has a subject and a verb. And in a passive sentence, the subject might come at the end of the sentence. Like, Joe was amazed by the starlight would be a passive sentence. The starlight amazed Joe would be an active sentence. And one easy way, if you write a longer story and you want to see if you use a lot of too much passive voice, is just do a search for the word by, B-Y. And you'll find that if you say things like, I was amazed by, you can just rewrite that to this amazed me or something, you know what I mean? That doesn't mean all passive is bad. 30% of your story is passive, that's fine. You just don't want 70 or 80%, which is what a lot of people do. And that doesn't mean the word by is always, passive either. You could say, I walked by the store. That would not be a passive sentence, but I think you would get it when you read it. And when stories are written with mostly active sentences, mostly powerful verbs, interesting adjectives, provocative nouns, it all sort of adds up almost subconsciously in the reader's mind that they're reading something that is very enjoyable. And of course, the very best writers, the masters, will do that for sure. But returning to the very beginning of this, in terms of how do you translate your research into something simpler that a lay person like me can understand, I'll go back to that analogy, talking about analogies, that golf swing analogy or that dumb it down analogy. When the golf pro tells me to swing at 20%, I'm swinging really at the right speed. When you feel like you're writing for a fifth grader, you're probably really writing for the right speed. You know what I mean? And then once you've written something, and there's a difference between writing something like 100 words and something that's like 1,000 words. If it's 1,000 words, the next thing you want to look for is do you have a hook? And then is there some kind of tension or drama? Like when we start learning to read and listening to stories from our parents way back when we were like 2 years old or younger, we are trained and it's wired to our brains that stories have some kind of tension. You start to read it and there's a reason to finish it. And that reason is tension. And for instance, reading that first paragraph, if you have any interest at all in astronomy or whatever, there's a tension created there that from birth almost drives you to want to continue to read. And I think that's all I got to say for now. So any questions on that, or?
Anybody's got any questions for Jim?
How about any difficulties that you're having?
I have a question.
Okay.
I wonder when you say interesting or like word, how can we find a word that is interesting?
That's a good question. One way you can do it is literally go through your story and look at, especially the top part of your story, which is most important. Look at what verbs you've used and see if you can find like a better verb, or more instead of like crawling, maybe a word like slithering. Um, Adjectives can be, look for nouns that don't have adjectives and see if you could add an adjective to that. You don't want to use too many adjectives. And of course, they all say a verb, avoid adverbs as much as possible, which is kind of true. But one thing about writing a story, and this is very important. Number one, if you're going to publish a story, it's not a story until it's published. And up until then, it's just a series of drafts. It's just a work in progress. So best advice I was ever given as a writer, because I've written about 10 novels. And, when you start a novel, it's like, wow, I got to write 120,000 words. Well, you don't write 120,000 words. You write 1 word, 2 words, 3 words, 5 sentences, 10 sentences, 1 page, 5 pages, and it sort of builds. And that's the way writing is. So when you're looking for interesting words, consider that, don't be afraid to write the first draft that's just complete garbage. Just get it done, and then go over it and improve it just a little bit on your second draft, and then improve it a little bit on your third draft. Like my novels, for instance, I drafted 25 times a piece, and I played all kinds of different games, or sometimes I would do a draft where I'd read it out loud, or sometimes I'd do a draft where I blew up the type to 200%, or I blew it way down to where I could barely read it. And every time you do that, you'll make little improvements here and there, and you'll see a sentence that you can improve, and you'll see, if I change this verb, make it a little bit better verb. Thesaurus can be your friend. I would use the thesaurus a lot to look for synonyms, especially if you're not real strong in our language, in the English language, or if you're not just a experienced writer. Thesaurus can help you with that. You can overdo it. I would say, as a writer, as you grow, overdoing it for a while probably isn't a bad thing, because then you'll come back to where you'll sort of a level area, and overdoing it will eventually help you discover what your voice is.
And I would say, just to add one thing about the thesaurus, most of you know I was an English major, so how I ended up in physics is amazing. But when you're using the thesaurus, especially, if you don't love language, or if English isn't your first language, I would be careful about choosing the replacement words that you find in a thesaurus. Make sure you don't use a word that you've never heard before.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You don't want to use something that you've never heard before just because it sounds fancier or it sounds more exciting. Because the thesaurus is going to give you a lot of synonyms, but they may not all be appropriate within the context of what you're writing. So. Right,
that's a good point, especially when you're trying to write accurate writing as opposed to fiction or something. Whenever I use a thesaurus, I always then look up the definition of that word too, just to make sure it fits. Because especially in science writing, the tiniest little tweak in meaning can make the difference between being accurate and inaccurate.
Right.
Okay, thank you. When you say source, what does the source mean?
The thesaurus is it's a guide that will, if you type in a word like machine, it will give you about 6 or 7 synonyms that also mean machine. And
like
so it's like a dictionary, only if you type in the word, let's say you typed in the word jump, it would give you leap, it would give you pounce, it would give you different words that are similar in meaning.
I think that it's not the source with S, is thesaurus.
Yeah, thesaurus.
Like a dinosaur. Like,
yeah. THE
and then saurus.
Yeah.
SAURUS.
Right.
Yeah.
Now,
Oh,
the source is important too, of course.
yes.
And speaking of that, of course, whenever I write a story, I always have the source vet it, look at it, approve it, make changes, because I'm certainly not beyond making errors. And very often, the source will make great changes. Sometimes they'll make annoying changes, but for the most part, I always vet my stories, if for the simple reason that if something's wrong, then there's two people to blame instead of one. um, But yeah, I think in terms of simplifying, you're being able to simplify your research. I've given you a lot to think about, but I'm not necessarily giving you too many tips on how to do that. And that, again, it boils down to the golf swing analogy and the dumbing it down analogy.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So when you wrote up this story, at what point did you refer back to Marco to sort of go over if whether you wrote was more scientifically accurate or not? So
Right. Well, with Marco, I never show him anything because I just forget Marco. No, I'm joking. No. I did the entire story. I wrote this entire story. I edited it several times. I showed it to one of my coworkers who caught a couple of typos, misspelled words, and then I sent it to Marco. And I also sent it to Dieter, and I sent it to Vidya, and I can't remember. I think Leah might have been in this one too. And they all vetted it. They all made their changes. I incorporated their changes. Since there were quite a few, I sent it back again and said, okay, here is the second draft with your changes. And then eventually the story was approved. I probably went through after that second time was approved. And then I sent it to University Relations, and they did a couple of small edits, and off it went.
So it's more of a collaborative thing, writing a story like this, rather than rather than being just reporter and an interview. It's more of a back and fro kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly right. When you're a reporter, you never show it to your source because that just breaks the rules. I mean, you call them on the phone. Sometimes you might read them a sentence. Does this sound accurate? And quotes, especially, like for instance, this first quote here. If Marco had just said we were able to measure and hadn't said from data collected by the Fermi telescope, as a reporter, I would have had to put that in parentheses. As a media relations person, I don't have to. I just have to show him the quote, and if he approves it or she approves it, we're done. And very often I will rewrite a quote even to what they didn't say. When I do that, I highlight it and put it in a comment and say, hey, I rewrote this quote. Is this okay with you, or do you want to mess with it a little more? And sometimes they do. But in writing a story like this, there's a little more leeway. There's a lot more leeway because you're vetting with the source. So as long as the source eventually approves it, what you're trying to do is create the most accurate story. And in fact, ironically, stories written by people like me and at Clemson are probably more accurate than stories written by journalists because they don't get vetted by the scientists. Much often to the scientists' surprise, I would imagine, when they read in the paper. But because I hear that all the time. Somebody will call me and says, they interviewed me and they got it all wrong. I'm like, sorry, I just set up the interview. I didn't write it.
This has been really good for at least for me. Like, I didn't know that you had so many steps in your writing process.
Mm-hmm.
I do have a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
What would be the top 3 or top 5 advices that you could give to someone like me or the rest of the group on how to talk to a journalist like you?
How to talk like face to face, or how to talk via email?
Yes,
or
because I'm imagining that you at some point had to sit across the table from
right,
from Marco and interview him for the story.
right.
If you could give like 3 or 4 advices on how to be precise and how to be proactive about that whole
Right.
the whole exchange.
Let me explain that in reverse, and then I'll answer your question. In reverse, like for instance, if I were going to interview you about your research, I would ask you to send me as much background material as you have, including the paper or whatever we're going to talk about in advance so that I could study it and read it. And then I would prepare a list of questions based off whatever you sent me. So in reverse, you can pretty much picture that, you know, journalists really actually will surprise you, I think, by how good their questions are. And so the only thing you really need to do is, number one, be well versed in your subject, which you already will be. And I would have some kind of, I think what you mentioned in an email, some kind of like an elevator pitch. I would have some kind of prepared response for the first question, which is, you know, tell me what your research is about, or tell me why your research matters. And then once you've done that and you don't stumble much over that, the questions from there will guide you pretty easily. I mean, from there, you'll get reporters and people like me will sort of layer questions in an order of importance, and there's a sort of a method to our madness, and part of it's freelance and part of it's prepared in advance and part of it's just the experience of having done it thousands of times. But I think you'll find that once you get into the middle of the interview, all you'll have to do is just respond with the knowledge that's already in your head. And if you say something that the reporter doesn't understand, he or she will ask you the question again, or ask you in a different way, or very often ask you a very similar question 20 minutes into the interview, and that's the time you'll answer a little bit better, given the context of what you've already said. Again, you need to think of it in terms of, like, for instance, if you were a car mechanic and you are an expert on brakes and you were talking to somebody who can't even put air in their tires, how do you explain that to them? You know, you have to really almost explain it from a very basic, you know, first you have to take the tire off, and you see what I mean?
Right. I mean, I'm just thinking from the perspective of my experience with Rebecca and her mother.
Mm-hmm.
They often complain about like the frustration of being on your seat, of like trying to talk to a scientist,
mm-hmm.
and have the guy repeat the same like 5 or 6 different terms for that one subject that he's studying.
Mm-hmm.
And you cannot get like an accurate analogy that you can both agree on.
Right.
So I guess like the reason for my question is, like, how would you go about avoiding falling into those pitfalls? Like how should I go about avoiding those pitfalls? That's what my question is.
Yeah. I think all of us who've ever had any education at all has had a bad teacher at one time or another, where no matter how much you paid attention, no matter how many notes you took, you just didn't get the teacher. The teacher was just terrible. And in the same regard, you're going to have bad interviewers and you're going to have bad scientists who are at least bad at that part of it. So there's no simple answer to that. If you get a bad journalist who asks stupid questions, it's going to be pretty hard for you to give smart answers, and vice versa. I would worry less about that and worry more about when you're in somewhere where you feel like you're being given a good interview, to then really focus on the questions, pay attention to the questions, and try to answer them as specifically, but also as relatively simple as possible. And a good interviewer will guide you into those things. In fact, a journalist will even kind of trick you into some things. So you have to be a little bit careful, depending on how provocative your topic is, because journalists can actually trick you into saying things maybe you don't want to say, and those are the surprises that come out in the paper the next day. But in terms of how do you avoid it, I guess my answer to that would be, you know, what you're doing right now is one of the ways to study it in advance and to think about it and to do it for yourself first.
I think, yeah, if I can just add to that, I don't mean to step on your toes, Jim, but
That's all right.
I think, Raphael, one thing about your specific question too is just it sounds like really just being deliberately consistent about your message. You know, I know there are probably 20 different scientific terms that could accurately describe, you know, some facet of your research. But it seems to me like if you're trying to talk to a layperson or trying to communicate that, you may want to stick with the same term every time so that you're not leaving your reader or your interviewer confused about, you know, well, you called it this last time and now you're calling it that, and you can't make an assumption that that person or that your reader knows that those two things are the same. I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah, I mean, I think this is a great way, obviously, to prepare for those kinds of things. It's just to talk about it and, you know, ask people like Jim who are really good at what they do and kind of know what they're talking about.
Yeah, I think at some point, I mean, either doesn't matter if we go into academia or into industry, at some point doing the good research, we might find ourselves in the situation that we're going to talk to someone like Jim. And, you know, from my perspective, I think this group is like a way to like get us to be as helpful to Jim as possible, right? So in the future, when we're, you know, interviewing for like a story or talking to someone, even on a job interview or whatever, we're going to be prepared for that.
Yeah, and I think preparing is just exactly that, preparing. I mean, thinking about it, you know, writing for yourself, preparing for yourself before you even present to anyone else, and then presenting to other people, taking advice. Here's a good example. Marco, who does very good interviews. This quote here, read that quote, "The first billion years." So he's talking about looking all the way back to the Big Bang. This is our ultimate goal. Obviously, if we can see all the way back to the Big Bang, who knows what we're going to see and what we're going to discover in so many ways, not just scientifically, but spiritually and just some of the best, most hidden mysteries of our universe will be hidden right within the moment of the Big Bang. When you're thinking about ways to communicate with media and preparing for an interview, having something like that in your back pocket, ready to go somewhere down the road, you'll during the interview, you'll sort of pick up on when you want to lay that one out. But that's a very powerful quote, especially to anyone who knows anything at all about astronomy. So, you know, and Dieter Hartmann is another person who does great interviews. He's like a quote machine. I mean, everything Dieter says is like this golden quote. And like here, read this one here. The star formation is a great cosmic cycling and recycling of energy, matter, and metals. It's the motor of the universe. That's a great analogy. Very simple. And without it, we wouldn't have the fundamental elements necessary for the existence of life. I mean, that's very powerful, provocative, entertaining, creates tension. Just reading that, you don't even realize it, but just reading it out, but your heart rate goes up a little bit. And writing can do that. Writing can, you know, change people's lives. Writing can make people cry. Writing can make people laugh. Writing can inspire people into doing things. So can your research. Your research is very important. What scientists do is crucial to the world and crucial to the existence of humankind. And now so more than ever, no reason you can't say things like that. No reason, because it's accurate. It's not just dramatic. It's not just, you know, it's not just dramatic. I mean, it's accurate to say that. So why not say it? Say it not in those exact words, but say it in how your research plays that role. That's what a journalist is going to want to hear. That's what the reader's going to want to read.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to that why is it important question.
Right.
Because it has to be important to the reader, you know, and all the technical aspects of it and the very specialized aspects of it are very exciting for scientists, but the average reader, I guess, is not going to really understand why they should care about that,
Right.
because they don't understand it.
Right. I mean, there have been times where I've been sitting in a doctor's office, say, and it's one of those appointments where you're 45 minutes late, and I'll pick up some garden magazine that I could care less about, and I start reading an article, and next thing I know, I've finished a 3-page article, and it wasn't because I even cared about the subject in that case. It was just because the writing was so compelling, and I was trained from age 2 years old to when I start a story to want to know what the ending is. Writing can do that too. So,
wow, we set out to talk about how do we speak to a journalist, and ended up having a master class on how to write. That's fantastic. Thanks a lot, Jim.
Yeah, you're welcome. I would like to say the other 3 members of my staff, we have a science writer, we have a guy who's an expert, who is a longtime journalist who received a lot of pitches, and he could speak to what attracted him and what didn't. And we also have a marketing person who has a lot of experience. So I don't know if you have interest in them joining you even for 10 or 15 minutes for questions and answers anytime in the future. I could let them know.
Absolutely. I think, as you know from the email, one of the things that we've been doing is to have challenge each other to like come up with little sound bites and like hooks and like all the things that you guys are very familiar with. And having someone like you come to our meetings and like give us feedback on how we're doing would be pretty incredible.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So for our last week, we had an assignment for each other. Do you remember the details of the assignment, Amanda?
I can look at it real quick. Yeah, it was wasn't this one to come up with your hook?
Yes.
Yeah.
Like in a little like short type of. Uh-oh, I lost you guys for a second. In a little short, I don't know, 10, 15 seconds, how would you describe your research?
Jim, do you have a minute to
yeah, sure.
to hear what everybody came up with, and just if you have any feedback?
Yeah, definitely. I have time today for sure. There, just like anybody, there are some weeks where I wouldn't be able to join every week because I just get so busy. But I have plenty of time today.
Yeah, and since we've got you here, I think the students would really benefit from that too.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great.
Thank you.
I mean, and this is the other thing too. Like, don't feel compelled to do it. If you.
No, this is fine.
I mean, yeah. And
if you're the student, you mean? Yeah.
For the students too. I mean, I'm saying, if don't feel compelled to share your thoughts and do the same thing. Like, we're just here to like get better, but we don't want to put anybody on the spot, right?
Right.
With that being said, do we have any takers?
Don't everybody go at once.
All right, I'll do mine.
All right.
I had to write this and actually practice on how to say it. So here we go. I am an Aurora Borealis storm chaser, like Jim Cantori for the Northern Lights. That's it. What I study is mostly like the effects of Aurora Borealis storms into the atmosphere. So that's the whole.
So you were going for something. You're going for something really short, in other words.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, we try. What we did last week was a 5-minute time span talk. So, I think that like when I heard myself talking again after the meeting, I realized that I blew past the 5-minute mark, and 2, I was talking way beyond what I should. So for this, I realized that I needed to like go back to the very, very basic.
Well, do me a favor. Do that golf swing analysis and read that exact same thing, but read it almost like you feel like you're reading it in slow motion.
Okay. I'm an Aurora Borealis storm chaser, like Jim Cantori for the Northern Lights.
Sorry, my phone. Anybody have reactions to the second version? To me, it sounded like the perfect speed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you're gonna, especially if you have any kind of accent, you're speaking to someone not familiar with that accent.
Ooh, that's good.
Slowing down too is an important thing.
Yeah, not doing what I do and talking louder. All of you international students probably when you first came were like, why is this lady yelling at me?
But I thought what you wrote was good. I thought when you slowed it down, it was even better.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I really like that you called yourself an Aurora Borealis storm chaser. That has obviously universal appeal. I think we all know what a storm chaser does and is, and it sounds exciting.
Right. And if you're from Florida and the South, you know who Jim Cantori is.
Jim Cantori.
Right. Right. And of course, the next step would then be describing what that is.
Right.
In a way that people understand. Most people have heard that, but still, going into some basic detail about what that is and what it means to chase it.
Right.
Yeah. And another thing is that you in the beginning, the beginning of your sentence, you said I'm an Aurora Borealis storm chaser, and then you said like the Jim Cantori of the Northern Lights. So, and that's what I talked about last week too, is like making assumptions. Even though the Aurora Borealis is very popular, I think that's even something that you shouldn't assume that everybody knows what that is.
See, I learned.
You shouldn't assume necessarily that everybody knows that the Aurora Borealis is what we call the Northern Lights. So I like that you included both.
Does anybody else want to have a little fun with it?
You can, even if you didn't prepare something, if you want to try to come up with something off the cuff.
I wonder, is this something about our research or no?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like if you could sum it up in sort of one sentence, just to give people like a very, very broad idea of what the nature of what you do is. Does that make sense?
Yes, because I was not here last week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's okay.
That's actually part of the fun too, because like you're not always going to be prepared for talking about this stuff, right? So that's kind of like in a way you're going to see yourself like improving, but don't feel compelled to say anything, just.
I would say like if you found yourself on an elevator with like a reincarnation of Albert Einstein and he asked you, hey, what do you do? And you have 3 floors to tell him what you do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's.
Let me search some word.
Well, like Yame, Yame. Is that how you pronounce your name? Yame?
Yame.
Yame. Let's pretend right now, suddenly you've been dragged into a room and said, this reporter wants to talk to you. And you're like, what the heck? And I sit down with you and I say, hey, I hear that you're a scientist in physics and astronomy. Describe to me what your research is. And just rather than describing to me what your research is, what would be the first sentence you would say? So describe to me what your research is.
I'm thinking about a fancy way to describe.
Well, just you don't
start
have
with
time
the basics.
you don't have time to think of it. What just comes, the first thing that comes into your head? Describe to me what your research is.
Oh, thermoelectric material. Let me describe a little bit. trying to use your body thermal energy, just like in the film, the Matrix. Is that good?
Yeah. Trying to use your body energy,
Yeah, body thermal energy.
thermal energy. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then why would you want to do that? What?
Because we
you know,
have a lot of like waste heat in industry or in our car or daily life, like even our body like heat that comes out into the environment, that is a waste of energy. We can use that. Just like, I'm not sure, because I just watched a film that's called The Matrix. Hopefully everyone watched that before.
mm-hmm.
So that also used the body energy of a human being, like a human being. So it's kind of like that.
All right, so right off the bat, that would be my lead. I can guarantee you as a reporter, that would be my lead. Something involving the Matrix and how it ties to your research. So then I would ask you, so that's great. That's like awesome. So then I would ask you, well, how is this an improvement? How is your research improving this?
Because their efficiency is not that high, not like photoelectricity. It's kind of like only 0.5 or just 1% the efficiency. We need to find, or just like cooking, make some material to make the efficiency higher.
And why is efficiency important? I mean, what benefits come from efficiency?
Because if the efficiency is not high, we may need to use a lot of money, for example, to connect those energy, or use a lot of material. That's not good, right?
So you're saying that this could save industry a lot of money and also materials?
Yes.
All right, so there's the beginning of an interview as an example of how an interview would begin. And as a reporter, I would keep asking questions that would go a little bit deeper, a little bit deeper. I would eventually return to what you said about the percentage. I would have written that down and to ask you to explain that in more detail. But you can see how an interview begins to progress. So you're not necessarily completely on the hook to do everything, and the reporter just sits there and writes down all the brilliant stuff you say. The reporter or the media relations person or whatever is going to sort of guide you through the process using their experience. So your expertise, your scientific brilliance, and the reporter's ability to translate that work hand in hand.
Wow.
Thank you.
I don't know if that makes you feel any better or makes you feel worse.
I feel like you are really good. Is that called interviewer? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like you must not be prepared. You know nothing about my research, but you can ask something that I really feel you understand what I'm talking about.
Right. And sometimes interviews aren't about, it's not like necessarily entirely about your research, but you might have some expertise in a broader subject. Let's say some part of your research had something to do with COVID-19. I might come in as a reporter and just ask you one general question about one aspect of COVID-19. You'd give a good solid quote, and that'd be the end of the interview. And then you would be one of 10 people who were quoted in the story. You'll get a lot of that too. That's probably easier. Again, sometimes reporters will try to reach and try to get you to say something that you are not comfortable with saying. So just if you ever are in a reporter situation, reporters aren't bad people. We're just kind of clever, and we're looking for the most dramatic thing. We're looking for the most entertaining thing. We're trying to be accurate, but we're not gonna. We try to get scientists to say things that they tend to be hesitant to say sometimes.
And
Now, I won't do that. If I interview someone like me, someone from Clemson, we won't do that because we work for the same company. We're on the same team. My goal is to make you look good. I'm your buddy in this situation. And I won't be trying to trick you, other than I will try to bring, if I feel like you're in a shell of some whatever making, I will try to bring you out of that. And by the end of it, usually will. And and lots of times my question is, you might think to yourself, third time he's asking me that question. Well, it is the third time I've asked you, but there's a reason why it's the third time. And I guarantee you, if I ask the same question 3 times in a 60-minute interview, that third time I ask it, I'll get the best answer.
Interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I wonder how you train yourself this, like, be more professional like this, and how long did you take to think?
Well, I went to college for it, just like you guys are, you know, and I worked for the St. Pete Times. When I worked there, was one of the top 20 newspapers in the country, and I worked with people who won Pulitzer Prizes, and I think I won 35 or 40 awards, big awards and things. So I was a pretty knowledgeable journalist at that point. But again, what you do, I wouldn't have a clue what you do. So we all have our expertise as scientists, especially. I've always, you know, people call themselves an amateur scientist or an amateur astronomer or whatever. I'm just one of these people that's always been fascinated by science, and I think I sort of am slightly better than the average layperson at picking up on it. At least, you know, reporters, like I mentioned earlier on, we're great at becoming mini experts. It's like when you study for an exam and then you take that exam, you make an A. If you took the exam 2 weeks later, you might make a C because you've forgotten half of what you studied for. Well, journalists are that way, but a month later, I couldn't probably tell you a third of what you told me. But when I sit down to write the story, I've got it nailed pretty good. Mowing their yard.
Berto.
Yeah.
Question?
It feels like you're dying to give your quote.
Oh, does it?
I could see him chomping at the bit.
I didn't think I was getting off that energy.
Your cheese all over the place, man.
Yeah, I should have turned off my video, apparently. So, I guess fundamentally, I tried writing some things down to see what made the most sense while you guys were talking. So I'm trying to understand why certain elements are made in particular environments, essentially. I guess is the easiest way to understand that.
That I would say would need at least one follow-up sentence that goes into some description about what the elements are and how that factors into your research.
So it would be, I guess.
Yeah, and that, to me, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's fine.
But I know that you're an astrophysicist. Like, I know that's but from what you said, if I didn't know who you were and didn't know what you did, that might not be apparent.
Yeah, I mean, it's because when Raphael asked this question about interviewers and how they get them to talk, I was thinking like we spend, you know, however many years, like close to 10 years or something like that, doing our research, and we get used to using certain jargon.
Right.
But you know, when you're first learning it, you don't know that jargon, right? You're trying to learn it just like the interviewer has no idea.
Exactly.
So I was trying to go back, you know, far enough to where it was almost as if I didn't know the jargon that I know now and use simpler words.
Right. Yeah, I think the way you worded that would make sense in a story. Maybe the lead sentence or a very readable, understandable sentence. It would just need another sentence to follow it, another to follow it. And, you know, if I were interviewing you and I asked you what your research about and you said that and stopped, well, then I would say another question to prompt you to keep going.
Right.
But that is an excellent example, actually, though, of the dumbing it down. To you, that probably seems like absurdly simple. To the average person, that's something that does not sound absurdly simple, but is something they can understand. And that's exactly what you're trying to achieve.
It's also like something that would inherently like keep the person interested in what he's gonna say next, right? Like I immediately wanted to ask, like, where is this thing happening? Like, what kind of materials?
Yeah,
are you
and that was
making?
my point. Like, I think it's I like the simplicity of what you said, but I would just maybe add like in space or in the galaxy at the end of it.
Or from stars or something like that. But yeah.
Like in certain environments in space. Or, in so, you know, just to kind of, because that lets us know, like when I think of elements, I think of like the first thing that I think of is like earth, you know, iron and, you know, things that we find in dirt that I understand are also in stars. But if I'm somebody who knows nothing about astrophysics, that might not be the first place my mind goes is, oh, he's talking about star stuff.
Right. Yeah, and then if you want to turn into something dramatic, it could be something like, you know, elements found in your backyard may have traveled 4 billion light years from a star in a galaxy far, far away or something. You know, then now you're getting into the more adding some drama and tension and entertainment to it.
Right.
Wow.
I'm just very impressed with all this good advice.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I don't feel like I've helped you much with how the best way is to simplify things. And I think maybe because I really don't have a great answer for that, other than I wouldn't worry about it too much when you're being interviewed. It would be more something to worry about when you're producing original content that's going to go directly somewhere, you know, if you're producing content that's going to go directly to the general public or directly to the media, that would be where you really have to pay more attention to simplifying. But in terms of being interviewed, I think the reporter will help you along those ways.
And I think I think that you have been incredibly helpful, at least from my perspective, because it seems like to me that for these guys, understanding the process that you as the journalist are going through to create the material, to create the story, probably helps give them an idea of where they fit into that and what their role in that is.
Well, thank
you. Would you guys agree? I think to me that was helpful to see like the process and understand the process.
Let me ask you guys a question, if you don't mind. I'm sorry. Maybe you don't even have time because you spend so much time in your research. How many of you just read for pleasure? Read novels, read fiction?
When I can.
In all your free time.
Because, you know, it depends on how important this is to you guys. I mean, whether this is just going to be a very minor part of your overall career, whether it's going to play a relatively major role. Reading will help you as a writer more than anything else. And so, you know, read things that you enjoy. I happen to love to read science fiction and epic fantasy. And in fact, I wrote a 6-book epic fantasy series that was published a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago now. But I love epic fantasy like Lord of the Rings and things like that. And writing from like Lord of the Rings has helped me write stories about, you know, microbes. You wouldn't realize how, but it does.
I have a question. And lately, someone gave me a suggestion to read the book, How to Write a Lot. I wonder, is that really a very good book for us to learn write proposal?
It's called How to Write a Lot, you said?
Yes.
Like a lot.
No, I think she's saying that she's heard that advice a lot, that reading will help you be a better writer. She was asking for specific books that might help learn to write proposals.
The name of the book is called How to Write a Lot.
Oh, it is?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Never mind. I'm sorry.
Well, put it this way. Books about writing, 90% of them are extremely helpful. And there are books about how to write nonfiction, how to write fiction, how to write characters, how to write scenes, how to write, describe landscapes. There's books even like writing for dummies. There are books that are just strictly about grammar and punctuation. And there are books about how to plot things. And, you know, when you write fiction, you have a plot. Well, you really have a plot even in nonfiction. There was a plot in that Marco story. Those are great to read. I highly recommend them. They might bore you to tears, but by the end of each one, about 10% of what you read will stick with you and will help. So if you have the time to do it and you have the gung-ho attitude to do it, I think it's fantastic. But you sort of, reading makes you a better writer by osmosis. You'll pick things up both on the conscious level, but also on the subconscious level. And unless you're born a genius, which most of us aren't, I know I wasn't, you'll never be a good writer unless you read a lot. But that might not be that important to you guys. I mean, you guys just need I'm sure, a certain level. Some people, scientists like you, will actually go into communications. Obviously, I'm sure you've done plenty of done that. That in that case, you really would want to spend a lot of time on this. But just what you're doing now is probably enough for what you're going to need in your careers.
Oh, that's reassuring.
Jim, I know there's, isn't there I know for the university, isn't there like I don't know what you would call them, like a proposal editor that will look over proposals? And is there anything like that in the college level? No,
there really isn't. We do have a freelance editor that's on our webpage that does, I think probably would charge $250. That's probably pretty helpful, but I don't know of any free. There could be. I don't know of any though. I know that my department doesn't do that. We'd be overwhelmed if we were asked to do that.
Yeah, that's a good follow-up question though. Let me. So sometimes we are faced with the prospect of like having to respond to questions to a reporter that's outside Clemson.
Right.
If that ever happens, is your department people that I could like reach out to and like have an initial conversation about what I'm gonna do and like kind of sort of quote unquote be prepared for it?
Yeah, that's definitely what we do, and I would highly recommend you doing that too. A lot of people don't do that and can be caught off guard, and sometimes, rarely, but sometimes you might even be dealing with somebody who's not legitimate. We'd be able to let you know that, because there will be people out there who might try to set you up in some way. Next thing you know, you're being quoted saying that Trump should be assassinated, and you're like, wait a minute, I didn't say that.
Oh my
gosh. But that's rare. But anytime you
Right.
have any kind of public visibility or you have any kind of reputation as being an expert in something, there's going to be somebody out there that might want to try to take advantage of it. So someone like a Marco's level, he's savvy enough to know, but he has to be careful because what he says carries weight. And there were a couple of places that picked up the story that kind of twisted it around, and they were like places like the New York Post, they sensationalized almost everything.
Right.
So, but yeah, we routinely give that kind of advice. In fact, recommend it that you contact us, especially if you have any feeling that you'd like to.
All right.
If one other thing, if you're ever contacted by email about something like, hey, call us and we'll quote you, and all it costs is $150, and you'll get make sure you call us about that too, because we can hunt those things down really fast and very often have done that.
That's really good to know. So does anybody else wants to ask any questions to Jim? We don't want to take too much of his time. We're already 15 minutes over. Anybody? All right. I guess we can wrap this meeting up. Thanks a lot, Jim, for coming and talking to us.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Yes.
Thank you.
It was great.
So I'll send you, Rafi, I'll send you an email afterwards of the 3 people I was talking about, and you can see whether or not you want to invite them at any time.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Excellent.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, guys, you have a great week. I'll see everybody next week.
Stay
Bye.
safe,
Great
y'all.
day. All right. We'll see you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.